That's right. And so couple things. Let me go ahead and share my screen. I think that's the next step here. You guys will just tell me if everything's good or not. Okay, let me do this. Okay, do you see this PowerPoint presentation?
Yep.
That's so good. Now, do you see it real big?
It is big.
Oh, that's fantastic. Okay, so Ivy on the Wire, which is actually a title for this historically based video game that we came out fairly late in the process, actually quite late in it. But yeah, it is a serious game for Arkansas history. And part of what we're doing is having a series of Zooms around the release event for this game that are going to, I think, dig into what is meant by that, a serious game. I think the connection with Arkansas history is going to be real obvious. But I think most people still don't think of games as being serious or having a serious function, but they certainly can and do, and especially in a educational context. So just to set the stage for what we're doing, this is the first of 4 Zooms as part of, don't use that button, as part of this release event. And so we're going to be walking through how the game got structured, a little bit about its history of how it came to be. And then we're going to have like, what are the histories behind this game that it's trying to sort of weave together. So we have a narrative walkthrough of the game. Then we have Japanese American internment, and Joshua Youngblood is going to talk about that from our libraries. I'm going to talk about the Italian POW experience because Jody Barnes, the former station archaeologist at Monticello, has taken a new job pretty recently in South Carolina and is actually an archaeologist in the field right now. So she is unable to do this Zoom. But just so you all know, I'll be drawing heavily upon her series of published articles because she has really done a lot of really cool archaeological work on Monticello. Then Jeannie Wayne is going to talk about African American peonage. So that's our lineup for today, but there are, you gonna work for me? That's just not the button. You're the button. Okay, so panel 2 is going to be about like how making the game itself was an historical praxis, a way of doing history. And that's going to really dig into how we made it, the kind of research that we did, how the game looks from the perspective of the different developers, like people working on sound, as opposed to the art, as opposed to the narrative, the storyline, as opposed to like patterns of interaction in the game. So that's our next Zoom. That's tomorrow at 5 to 6 p.m. Then Zoom number 3 is happening again tomorrow, April 8th from 7 to 8 p.m. That situates Ivy on the Wire, this serious historical game, in the context of the pretty healthy number of initiatives we have on campus right now that include real-time 3D, basically video game technology. And just having sort of a 5-minute overview of each one of those projects and then how they fit together and the implications there for digital humanities and video games and the connection between them. Then our last presentation, which we're super excited about, is going to feature Derek Ham, who's a designer and a VR developer at North Carolina State. Got his PhD from MIT. And has done just a great VR experience based on the final days of Martin Luther King, and is now working on a project on the Negro baseball leagues. And he's going to kind of first half about Martin Luther King, second half about Negro baseball leagues. And that's happening tomorrow at 8 to 9 p.m., which is just a fantastic way of closing this off. So if I don't think I've done this already, but I really, really want to thank all of you for being here. Especially on a day that's turned out to, after a rainy start, to be pretty nice. And we're going to dive into the making of this game and sort of the walkthrough of its storyline by first pointing out that this entire project, Arkansas Stories of Place and Belonging, Ivy on the Wire is just one piece of this larger project that's brought together just a range of humanities scholars at the University of Arkansas. It's been a fantastic 2-3 year process, and we were supported by a Chancellor's Fund grant, so that was fantastic. And we're just about wrapping up with that project, and it's been just a terrific ride. So, and I also want to take this event and look back to an event we held as part of this Arkansas Stories of Place and Belonging down in Monticello in Southeast Arkansas, November 15th, 16th, and 2019. And that was organized by Professor Kim Sexton in art history and architecture, and brought together a lot of people working on these stories, and like Monticello or Rower, Jerome, African American peonage, and brought a group of people together in Monticello, and we visited Rower. And I'm really proud of that. I think we all are, as a way of like bridging back and forth between up here in Fayetteville and the rest of the state. So that was a great event to hold down there. We had some special touches, like a memorable lunch in McGee that featured menu items from the camp at Rower. And similarly in Monticello, one of the restaurants attempted to reproduce menu items from the Italian POW camp. So it was definitely an experiential learning situation. So you'll note that this doesn't say now Arkansas Stories of Place Belonging. It says Trauma and Resilience. And actually our first sort of heading or title for this section of the work from this grant was Captivity and Resistance. But we decided on trauma and resilience for a number of reasons, as a way of thinking about, like thematically thinking about what we were about to do. We knew we wanted to weave together Rower, Japanese American internment, African American peonage or sharecropping, Camp Monticello and Italian POWs. We wanted to weave those stories together. They're all there in World War II in southeastern Arkansas. These are all stories, and captivity and resistance tends to be a pretty seriously black and white way of visualizing this, of stating this. And it also tends to have a fair amount of risk for victim blaming, like, did you resist? If you didn't resist, uh-oh. Right, so we're like, nah, it's more complicated than that. So we decided to kind of rename it in our minds in terms of what we were trying to do around trauma and resilience. And the key things, you've had time to read the slides, so I'm going to go through pretty quickly, but the key thing here is that trauma is not so delimited chronologically in time. Once it happens, it keeps on giving, in a sense. And so we know that the effects of Japanese American internment in terms of the traumatic effect on individuals and culture continues to be a thing. The entire history of African Americans, filled as it is with trauma, that this is an ongoing thing, which means the attempt to come to terms with it, the resilience part, is an ongoing thing. It's a process of healing, of coping strategies, sometimes of outright resistance. But it continues to be a thing. It's an ongoing dialogue between resilience and trauma that's going on now as a result of some of the things that happened during that period in Southeast Arkansas, and have continued to, in various forms, like be part of American life. So trauma and resilience is how we renamed it. And looking at some of the, for instance, some of the work being done now in terms of Native Americans and Indigenous people who study this, we could have used survivance as well for this. So that brought us to Ivy on the Wire, which is a character-driven 2D storybook style game, point and click style game. There is no like, you got to jump and shoot, or you have to be super like fast on the buttons, like 3D style. It's a much more contemplative game. But these games can build a surprising amount of suspense and a feeling of danger, partly because your brain is filling in more than it has to do for a 3D game. So we actually think there's a lot of power to that, and that very kind of spatial understatement to it. So we're very pleased with how this game turned out visually. In terms of where we started and where we ended up, we were initially going to make a 3D game based on Rower strictly, about when we first started the project. And we were going to work with, there's just a terrific 3D model of the Rower camp that's been developed by the Center for Advanced Spatial Technologies here on our campus. But a couple things, we wanted to make this web accessible. It had to play like through your web browser, which has a lot of performance requirements. And the cast model is partly fantastic because it's very detailed and it's very heavy. So we're like, oh, that's going to be difficult to transfer over to WebGL, to playing through your browser. And also they had a roadmap for that plan, for that model. It turned out to be a very good one because they just got a national park, another grant from the National Park Service. And so that is on a very successful trajectory. So we decided early on in conversation with CAST, okay, let's not do that. Let's think more about the broader history of captivity, resistance, trauma, resilience in Southeast Arkansas. And that led us to this, this game that would weave them together. And we also liked 2D because it took away the heavy 3D element, and it meant we knew we could get good playability through the browser. And that means a wide educational audience at least. And we really are bought into that as one of the things we want, one of the audiences we want to reach. We knew this would require like a lot of research across each one of these situations, whether it's Japanese American internment or Italian POWs or African American peonage. We've been very fortunate to work with the members of that humanities committee, with Joshua and with Jeannie. Very fortunate to meet with Jody Barnes down in Monticello. So there's been a lot of research background here. And one of our really central goals was to get our players to think comparatively across these forms of captivity, resistance, trauma, resilience, and develop historical empathy around that, because that ability to identify back into that period of time and what was going on can translate into a more critical awareness of what's going on now. And so this engagement with the past ends up being an engagement with the present, and hopefully a more critical, empathetic one. So that's really a key goal for our game development. So this is just sort of a handy chart for what are we talking about? Confinement of Japanese Americans, 1942 to 1945, about 8,500 at the peak. Context, diaspora, cultural heritage, formal racism, issues of poverty, nutrition, and health in the camp, sometimes brutal labor conditions. For African American peonage, this obviously has its roots in enslaved people, in slavery. And so this is a long process, and I think many would argue has led to forms of incarceration, a carceral system, dare I say it, structural racism that's with us now. For Italian POWs, it's a really different situation. In some respects, their situation was way better than it had been in Mussolini's army, on the one hand. On the other hand, they are imprisoned. And there is labor, and the labor conditions are not great. They are paid for that labor. And in fact, their labor is undercutting sort of wages and working conditions for American poor rural workers, farm workers in Eastern Arkansas. So that's significantly different, right? So that's kind of what's on the table for us putting this game together. We knew in terms of structure, so what's meant by branching narratives is you get to choose a number of different pathways through the story, which means it has high replayability. Like you won't get the game is doing some things you won't see on the first playthrough. Like you can go down one branch, another branch, and the characters look different depending on the branch, and the actions, the world looks a bit different depending on which you chose. We also wanted to weave in folk tales from each of these cultures, because they all have very strong Japanese American folk tales, African American folktale tradition, and Italian folk tales. And so we wanted to be able to pull on that tradition of telling stories in each of these cultures and kind of use that like a chorus in a Greek tragedy to comment upon the action, right? And also to point to this storytelling traditions as a form of almost cultural resilience, like one of the coping strategies for people in this situation. Okay, so there's our folktale matrix of ones we're like, which ones are going to work best for this game, kind of pulling them out, comparing them so we can make a final decision as to what folktales we might want to plug in where. Okay, and so we have four characters, Miho Matsumoto, who's a teenage girl who's in Rower, and there's her character arc, like the set of actions that are key moments for her over the course of the story. And you'll see scene number, more than 20. So our scope concept for the whole game is actually quite large. What we're releasing today is a prototype, what we might call a vertical slice of that. That gets you an understanding of the game, the characters, how the game works, but isn't by no means the full game situation, which will require a lot more support to develop that whole thing. So we've cut it down to a representative slice, which we think is still a very effective game. But this is the overall arc for that larger, probably an hour and a half of gameplay for this larger game. And the game as we've released it is somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes. Okay, so Miho is one character. Leslie Coase, an African American who's just won at the beginning of the game, a pretty important peonage case. But that doesn't mean Leslie can find work after that. That doesn't mean Leslie escapes racism and inequity because he won that case. And so that's his arc as he tries to chart his way to what is still a very difficult situation defined by a kind of certainly structural racism and captivity. Character number 3, Margaret Halstead. She's kind of the glue. She's a Yankee, as people never tire of telling her in our game. And she is sort of like the reporter of the 4 characters. That's visiting the conditions of each one of these groups and reporting back on them. And she's modeled on a historical character, Quackenbos, who did this kind of research on peonage in the early 20th century in Arkansas. So she connects the characters together and moves between them, but she's not an ideal character. We really wanted to be careful, like the sort of white savior complex. Margaret's a difficult character. She's complex and far from perfect. And so she's very, and as you play the game, you move between being one or the other of these characters. So Angelo Marini is our last one. He's the Italian POW. His arc is shorter, right? He's like, his story begins in 1943. It's a little more like steep, jagged, like not as much of a longer arc, but some key things there. I mean, he's engages in agricultural labor, timber, experiences pretty serious depression as part of his experience in the camp and the larger concept of the game, and also becomes aware of the experience of Italian immigrants, right, that came to Arkansas in the early 20th century and faced conditions as brutal as African American peonage, right? So he gets some concept. Oh, this is, so I'm experiencing this, but this is what was happening to Italian, like people from families that are in the camp. This is what happened to them earlier in America. So this is different. And he ends up in a fight with African American soldiers at the end of his arc. We're still trying to figure this one out because this obviously can be really charged, ethically charged. So our writers and as a development team are wrestling with that one. So if you put all these together, you have a pretty nice overall arc for the whole game, as we would tell it, sort of up and then down and up and then down and up again and down. So that's a really classic sort of narrative flow. So we're very pleased to see the arcs of our 4 characters work together in this way. So that is a general background. And here's where we would drop in our folk tales to comment upon key moments of the story, like high tension moments. So that was our grand structure that we have in mind for this game. We can build it to be a full hour and a half, maybe even 2 hours of gameplay. So now what I'm going to do is pass this off to Brianna Jenkins, who's the art director for Test Track. And she's going to lead us through what we've actually released today.
Yeah, so this should be pretty quick. You gave a really great setup for the overall project. You can go ahead and go on to the next slide, Dave. So as Dave was saying, actually making all, more than 20 episodes would take a lot more support, a lot more time, but we cut it down to 5 scenes. And I think it's a pretty effective vertical slice of what we're trying to get at. So to start us off, these are each of our characters from left to right. We have Miho, Margaret, Leslie, and Angelo. Dave gave a little bit of background about each of these. You can go on to the next slide. So in our vertical slice, we start at scene 5. So Leslie is arriving at the McGee train station. He's trying to find a job to make money to get home to his family. Here he encounters some racism and a threat basically to end up back in peonage, which he just won a case to get out of, which was pretty rare for the time. Go to the next one. Directly after finishing that scene, while you're still kind of in the trap of, possibly being forced back into that situation, you don't really know what's happening, you switch over to Margaret's perspective, who arrives at the same train station to find Leslie being threatened. So she intervenes, and you manage in the vertical slice to get the Klansman to back off, and then have a conversation with Leslie. So Margaret has traveled here trying to find Leslie because she heard about his landmark case that he won against his peonage conditions. And she tries to interview him. Like we said, these, or like Dave said, these interactions can be pretty complex between these characters. I think that's a pretty good example of it. So he's kind of like, I need to go on with what I'm doing. You're kind of a liability to me, but she's trying to get the information for her article. You can go on to the next one. Then we have scene 9, which is Margaret again. So she has moved on from when she interacted with Leslie, and she's now gone to the rower internment camp. So she's heard about the conditions down here, and she's really interested in investigating for herself, trying to figure out what's actually going on. So you manage to get your way into the camp. You have various means that you can do that. Not so truthful, maybe sneaking in, but she gets a chance to explore through the camp and then ends up interacting with Miho. You can go on the next slide. So the entire time that she's exploring and investigating the camp, Miho is watching her, kind of trying to figure out who she is and why she's there. And how you decided to enter the camp as Margaret kind of colors what Miho thinks about you. So she could either from the beginning believe that you're a journalist, or maybe she just saw you sneak in. So that sets the stage for how hard this interaction is going to be. So Miho has the goal of trying to get her father released because he's currently locked up for answering no against the loyalty questionnaire that was released in the camps. You might hear a little bit about that later, but basically it was a questionnaire trying to get the Japanese internees to say that they were absolutely loyal to the US and that they would renounce their citizenship to Japan, which of course is a very controversial and pretty terrible thing to, force them to do under threat of getting, locked up or sent to another camp for being disloyal. So Miho's trying to convince Margaret to help her get her father out of the temporary imprisonment that he's in. And how you do in this has various outcomes. So this is more of a puzzle to try to get the best outcome. Go on to the next slide. And then finally, we have scene 13, which is from Angelo's point of view. This is more of a movie type scene, so you don't have a lot of choices here, and you kind of just see the actions develop as you click through. So Angelo is working as a contract laborer at a lumber mill. And during his work there, he sees some other POWs try to escape. Um, I won't spoil it, but he has the opportunity to try to escape himself, and he makes the decisions to escape or not to escape. But it's a pretty interesting, look into the life of a POW at the time, an Italian POW. You can go to the next slide. So why did we choose these scenes for the vertical slice? So obviously they introduce each of our characters, which is definitely something we wanted to do with our vertical slice. It also introduces a nice variety of our different kinds of scenes. So like I said a little bit, the first scene is more of a trap scene where you're threatened and you end on kind of a cliffhanger there. The next is an interview, so that's Margaret and Leslie talking. You're trying to get information from him. The scene in the internment camp is exploration, so you're going around trying to find different pieces of information, interacting a lot with the environment. The next is a puzzle. You're trying to move through this conversation to get the best outcome. You really have to weigh your options. And then the next is more of a movie type scene. We think incorporating all of these different types gives this kind of game a lot of variety and can be more interesting than just having one single type of gameplay all the way through. And also standing alone, these different scenes have a really nice set of arcs of tension and release. So you're not constantly kind of like at the highest point of tension. Moving forward, so before we try to apply for more support to develop the whole game, we definitely want to introduce one or two folk tales into the prototype because I think that's a pretty important part of our idea for the game. We'd also like to build out the internment camp a little bit more. So we had ideas for different areas in the camp, but we had to cut those down just in the interest of time. We'd also like to flesh out the mental health and the journal and inventory mechanics. So in the game, you have access to an inventory, and the choices that you make also affect your mental health. Those are in a very basic sort of way, but we definitely want to develop them more. And then also just a wider round of testing and UX improvements based on that feedback. Next slide. As far as which tale we'd like to insert, we are really interested in using O Sun the Chain to frame this vertical slice. And this is a Japanese folk tale. It has themes of oppression and escape, as well as kind of mother figure into monster, which I think works really well for these different scenes. Escape is a really large theme throughout the ones that we picked. And like Dave said, it reinforces our themes in sort of a meta way, kind of commentary, and gives the player a chance to pause and reflect on the overall narrative. Yeah, so that's what I have as far as our current development. I think next is Joshua.
Yeah, Joshua's coming up next, and so I'm going to go ahead. We're just going to have this one screen share, so I'm going to start his slides right now. And I think it's probably a good idea to hold questions till the end. And you might, so you don't forget them, because that can be a thing, you can actually use the chat to just introduce questions there, and we'll try to run through those and answer them in the order that they were asked. But you can use the chat to get your questions out. It's kind of helpful. So let me skip that down there.
While that's coming up, I'll say hi. My name is Joshua Youngblood. I am not a member of this amazing team that put this game together, although I was able to contribute a little bit of research here and there. I am part of the Arkansas Stories Committee, though, and so I've gotten to watch along as the progress has been made and to see how the story arc has developed, and to actually, I got to test the game a little bit as well, which is really fascinating. So what I'm going to talk about with this plainly titled slideshow here, Japanese American concentration camps in Arkansas, if I were to reframe this idea, I might say beyond the barbed wire, or an idea of the stories that are embedded in Rower and how those intersect with the area of Southeast Arkansas, which I think the game does such a beautiful job of exploring. I will say that all the images that I'm going to show you are available in any one of the number of great digital projects out there exploring Japanese American internment and concentration camps in the United States. Many of them supported by the National Park Service, as Dave referred to earlier, but there are some great ones out there. I'm not going to take the time to cite all of them, but between the Densho project, Calisphere's digital archive, our own Rising Above project that we've done here with CAST on campus, Life Interrupted, which is now 16 years old, but was produced out of Little Rock, and then also the work by Arkansas State University, as well as many other places. There's a wealth of material out there. But the work of making those stories mean something and making them accessible for new generations of students, I think, is an ongoing project. And so it's great to see this happening here as part of Arkansas Stories. And before we go to the next slide, I will comment on this one image here. This is one of the first images I found when I started studying Japanese American internment when I came to Arkansas. And when I first saw this image, I thought of it as a whimsical or even a propaganda shot. And so I thought, oh, isn't that funny? Those lovers having a great time on a guard tower. And the more I've come to understand this, and honestly, as I went through the game, I came to understand this a little bit differently. And I'll touch on that a little bit later. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give just a brief overview, some of the key historical facts surrounding Japanese American internment. I know many of you understand this history well, but I will highlight some things. I'm going to talk generally about Japanese American internment for just a couple of moments, but really focus on Rower since that's where the game takes place. Speaking of images, this is an image that recently has been celebrated as part of the Dorothy Lang collection. I like that resonance because of the journalist who is featured in the game, who's trying to do investigative journalism. Dorothy Lang had her Japanese American dislocation photographs confiscated actually at the time. So this has come to light, and you'll notice this is family that may have been moved to Rower later, but you see that they've been labeled for transport here. And so again, back to the general history. So in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, February 19th, 1942, which allowed for the removal of Japanese Americans from their homelands and to take them out of the West Coast. So they moved them out of Washington, Oregon, and California. And then the War Relocation Authority, which managed the confinement sites and concentration camps across the United States, was established by 9102 a few weeks later. So Japanese Americans, many of whom were citizens, it's very important for us to remember, 64% of them were citizens, lost property, farms, businesses. Their communities were destroyed. Um, and they were first taken to temporary camps. Some of them were jailed. Some of them were put in Department of Justice camps instead because of suspicion of espionage, most of which was completely unfounded. And that all happened before they were even taken to concentration camps because the camps weren't even built yet when all of this dislocation and movement of the Japanese Americans began. Ultimately, more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were interred, and more than 16,000 of those came through Arkansas. So as I said, 64% of the relocated Japanese Americans were American-born citizens. Next slide, please, Dave. The camps that were established in Arkansas, which were Rower and then also Jerome, were put on FSA land, or Farm Security Administration land, for the most part. This is abandoned land, or land that had become delinquent because of taxes, had been used in the 1930s for New Deal projects. It was down in the southeast corner of the state, in Desha, Drew, and Chico counties. It was Delta land. It was flood prone, to say the least. It was subject to harsh weather. A lot of it had been reforested or had never been cleared. And so it was overgrown, swampy land. And the camps, as they were built, were encircled in barbed wire with guard towers, such as we saw in that first picture up there. The first arrivals at Rower were in September 1942. And they got there, as I mentioned earlier, before the camps were even constructed. So the first people that arrived had to help build the camps themselves. In that fall 1942, the Rower population peaked at 8,475, as Dave mentioned earlier, and then it would steadily decline for a variety of reasons over the next few years. Next slide. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what the blocks are like. You get to explore the blocks in the game, or the camp itself, the site. This is an actual photo. This is available from the Arkansas State University's page, and this is a bird's eye view of Rower. So it consisted, of course, all these blocks and then lots of other different buildings. So each block was designed to accommodate about 300 people in differently sized residential barracks. Those barracks were about 20 foot by 120 foot, divided into multiple apartments. And so there would be different families living in apartments, then all put in one barrack, and then multiple barracks into different blocks. The buildings did not have plumbing, and they were heated with wood stoves. In fact, that's all that was in the apartments when they arrived, if the apartments were finished out. And so completely unfinished, other than cots. And I said beds, that's very generous, just cots with wood stove. But in each block was the bones, so to speak, for a mini community. So each block had a mess hall building. There's a recreational barrack. There's laundry. There's communal latrine, because again, there were no bathrooms or plumbing within each of the barracks. So life was very regimented, but then there's also kind of the building blocks there to create micro communities. And then on the camp, which ultimately consisted of 500 acres of built environment, there was the administrative section, there were military police, there was a hospital, a warehouse, a factory, and then there was also schools, canteens. There was a co-op that helped provide motion pictures and a store. There were gymnasiums. Ultimately, there was even an auditorium and lots of other amenities there, although a lot of that was led, the development of that was led by the internees themselves. Next slide, please, Dave. So as we were discussing earlier, you can't understate, and you certainly can't grapple with the importance of trauma for Japanese American internees. So I wanted to address some of the types of trauma. This is an actual photograph on the right there of a flood at Rower. As I said earlier, the site was prone to flood, and so an already dislocated life would face even more disruption and difficulty. So there was the actual removal. There was severe racism. That was racism that faced in their home communities in California, Oregon, Washington State, of course. But then once you came to Arkansas, there was overt racism. The governor of Arkansas, who was notoriously a former member of the KKK, he was a racist himself, Homer Atkins. He also very publicly stated that he did not want Japanese Americans in the state as well, and he resisted it and had to be assured that there would be severe security that they'd be carefully guarded with guns at the camps to prevent the Japanese Americans from coming. And he also lobbied to keep them from ever wanting to resettle in the state. More trauma, of course, there was the loss of livelihoods, professional standing, and the legal and financial jeopardy. So there was a loss of businesses. There's also all the loss of assets. Many of the Japanese Americans were farmers or fishermen, but many of them were also in other areas of business. And so those assets were largely lost, or there was a struggle to kind of regain them as possible. And then there were the legal issues about trying to sue for recovered property or arguing against things like the disloyalty oath. There was the change in the living conditions, and this is another interesting part of the experience, and tragic in some ways, was the disruption to education of the children and to their lives. Now, the children managed to recreate a sense of community and to find educational opportunity at Rower and at Jerome and all the other camps, but there was a disruption in their development and their educational achievement. We see that with people that went to college or had to leave college, but also in the younger children as well. There's literally mud, cold, and then hot, and then cold, and then snakes and mosquitoes. This is a tough place to live that was largely underdeveloped. And so someone had to leave their home and then experience this difficult environment. There was a stress of confinement and the social tension. So you had several different generations or groups of Japanese Americans there. You had native Japanese, people born in Japan, you had people born in America, you had the Issei, who were the first generation Japanese, you had the Nisei, who were second generation. There was tension there. There was tension between who would take leadership roles. And then there was also just being confined with people and social pressures. Those social pressures resulted in fighting and rioting. There were cases at Rower of people in violent conflicts, some of whom had to be taken off-site and put into jail, or they were taken off-site. They were held under arm. And then there was, of course, people who were taken back into the Department of Justice camp system because of the loyalty oath and other issues. And we can't forget that these were still Americans, and many of them were families who were taking part in World War II, which was going on at the same time. Next slide, please, Dave. So we have to remember the loss, and at Rower, they remembered the loss immediately. In October of that first year, 1942, the first baby born at the camp also died, and that led to the establishment of a cemetery. This cemetery is still there. There's only 2 extant structures still at the Rower site: the cemetery, which began in 1942, and then a smokestack from the hospital that's still there. The cemetery was maintained over several years by Koheiji Hirasawa, who also designed these really breathtakingly beautiful monuments that are still at the site. There's a monument that honors the 168 internees who died at the camp. There's also a monument that was built later honoring all the soldiers who had been at Rower who then died fighting for America. Next slide, please. So while the living at the camp was harsh, while getting there was unjust, the people that lived there did have to adapt, and they did manage to create community there. On the left here, you see a painting by Henry Sugimoto, an artist, a very accomplished artist who was at Rower, who kind of imagined what life was there. I love this painting because you see the contrast between the harshness there, but also the gardens that have been planted. And on the right is a picture of the actual victory gardens and other private gardens that are built in between the barracks. Next slide. So how do you create community? Well, there were social and educational activities. Some of them were structured at the camp. Many of them weren't. There was artistic expression. There were religious services, which were very important. The site, there were Buddhists, there were Christians, there were other religions represented there. There were community events, which there was a very full calendar of community events happening at Rower and at Jerome the whole time. And there were sports. There were lots of sports teams, both intra-camp and then outside of the camp. They competed with whoever they could in football, in baseball, in softball. At one point, they had more than 30 softball teams at the Rower camp. And then there were opportunities to go beyond the barbed wire, to actually leave and either go to town or to take jobs and to work offsite in some cases. And so the internees that were there reshaped the camp as best they could into a community. Next slide, please. Here is on the left. Here is a clip from the Rower Outpost, which is a newsletter published twice weekly for the entire duration of the camp until it was renamed the Rower Relocator. This is available from the cast Rising Above website, by the way, where we digitize the entire newsletters. But you see Rower High, Blast Jerome. And on the right is a photograph of the makeshift baseball field at the camp, the baseball championship. And this is from the Life Interrupted project. Next slide, please. The art is really inspiring from Jerome. A part of the CAST project as well has provided 3D renderings in some cases and also lots of digitized examples of art produced there. But there was painting, there was sculpture. Some of the sculpture would use the cypress knees from the swamp. Rower became famous for cypress knee sculpture. And then there was other decorative arts. As I mentioned earlier, the barracks were completely unfinished. And so cabinetry, chairs, screens, the people living there made the space their own and made it beautiful in the ways that they knew how. Next slide. But ultimately, they had to have food, shelter, and they had to pursue livelihoods, even though they were in a different part of America and far away from what they considered to be their homes. The agriculture was hugely important at Rower. Rower was actually very successful agriculturally. These were people who had great expertise in agriculture, many of them. And so farm production there was so high that they actually exported out to military camps in Arkansas. And they did experience rationing and food shortages, but they also produced their own livestock for slaughter, including pork. On the right there is shoveling coal. As I mentioned, it's wood and coal-fired stoves. And so Rower and Jerome they shared a train line. And so sometimes there were coal shortages. In fact, one of the coal shortages happened in 1944 during the winter. And so they had to go back to harvesting wood in order to keep warm during that winter. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, internees took the opportunities to get off site whenever they could. And so they were able to extend their community in other ways. They did earn money on the site through work. There were opportunities to work in agricultural fields in the area. There were work camps in some instances. And then also they had a strong connection with the military. So many of the young men at Rower ended up entering military service, and there was a pattern of the Rower girls who would go down to Camp Shelby in Mississippi, which actually home to the famed 442nd, who were Japanese American soldiers who achieved great renown in Italy for their service, many of whom also died in service to this country. And so this picture here is actually from Camp Shelby when the Rower girls were able to go down there. But there was a strong connection between Rower and other places where Japanese Americans were able to leave camps and establish themselves in other places in the US, but also find ways to visit. Next slide, please. And so life at Rower was complex. And I just wanted to mention briefly that we have to keep in mind the contrast or the paradox of this camp and Jerome being in Arkansas, which was the nadir of the Jim Crow South. And so there was a lot of tension in the surrounding area because as bad as conditions were at Rower and Jerome, they made more money than any African American in the area for work. They had ready access to food. They did have freedom to leave the site. They actually had more liberties in some ways than a lot of other people, and economic opportunity in some ways than other people, while they were also experiencing violent trauma, severe injustice, and a complete curtailment of their legal opportunities. And I mentioned earlier the generational tensions, and there was the legal injustices that they had to navigate. I see a question from Professor Wayne. We'll get to it in a little second. And so I also mentioned that the internees were able to travel, and they were also at one point after exclusions from the West Coast, well, before the exclusions were lifted, they were given the opportunity to resettle in areas around camps. This is true nationwide, but they chose not to because they did not feel like it was a true choice to restart their lives. But they did find ways to extend camp life. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier the young men from Jerome who served in the armed forces. More than 800 men from Rower ended up serving in the military. Um, you've all heard probably of George Takei, one of many of the children who attended school at Rower. There was a lot of kids there, and there were kids that grew up there, and their earliest experiences in life were in a confinement site. And when you think of trauma, you think of the creation of generational trauma. Even though they had opportunities, they did create community. That is something that would last with them, go on. These young boys right here actually playing marbles in the dirt between their barracks. Next slide. All those schools were not ready to be open when the internees first arrived. You did have several years worth of teenagers who ended up graduating from the high school at Rower. On the right here, you see some images of the high school yearbook, and on the left here, you see a makeshift classroom that learn with what you have, right? So you have benches made out of wood that was found scrap lumber on the site, boxes used, and then this is one of the students leading the instruction. Next slide, please. And so the camps did close, of course. We all know that happened. World War II came to an end. But that is not the end of a story for these people at all. This image here is actually of Jerome, not of Rower, when it closed in 1944. Jerome was one of the first camp to close, and some of those internees were relocated to Rower, and then Jerome became a POW facility, which is one of the intersections with our game here. The closure of Rower was set for early 1946. Actually, was completed by November of 1945 when all of the internees were left. Only a few people with connection to Japanese American internment in Arkansas. Only a few of those Japanese Americans decided to stay in the state. They were able to do that. Most of them left, and most of them left as soon as they possibly could. So even though the opportunity was available to them, they did not stay here. They left. And the next slide, I did want to touch on a couple of themes that I think as the game evolves could be explored more. So some opportunities for further engagement with Rower in the space there. I've mentioned the artistic creation. Such an important window for people studying or coming to know what the experience at Rower was like. There were art classes, there were professional artists there, there were classes for young people, and so artistic expression, both formally and informally, were very important there. Both Rower and Jerome showed examples of physical resistance fighting and tragically self-harm. And so when we think of the dark stories that are there, Jerome experienced a few different suicides actually, and several that and some of those were received national attention, and investigators were brought in and became a very important story for the War Relocation Authority. It's how you deal with that. And there was also organized resistance. Sometimes that was physical. And so there were riots, there were protests, and there was organized political resistance to what was happening. And that could be explored even further, although the game does a really interesting job of looking at that. The frustration of professional and educational opportunity, I think, is something that could be experienced, that could be explored even more. And the difficulty of the labor that happened at the camp. And then I wanted to mention also just the microaggressions and the power differentials among the people there. So in any situation like that, particularly a situation under stress, there will be there will be struggles for social power or organizational power. There were elections that happened at Rower. There was self-governance there, but it was also the different social groups that had to try to navigate that environment. And meanwhile, they were also dealing with a very pronounced power differential between the authorities who ran the camp. So that'd be interesting to see how the game could move into those questions even further. So thank you so much for allowing me to test the game and for offering some remarks about the history of Rower.
For sure. And I think we might go over just a little bit in terms of time. Zoom is not going to care, but I think we're probably going to go over just a little bit, which is okay. So let me escape that one, hopefully. Okay. And it's gonna be a quick tour through the Italian POW situation. If I could find here. There we go. Here. Okay, and so very close to Rower. I mean, it's all this action is concentrated in that extreme southeast part of Arkansas is Monticello, and Camp Monticello is just outside the small city of Monticello. And unfortunately, the camp has not been added to like historical sites, and it's not receiving any protection, and there is no solid funding source to preserve it. And so the forest of Southeast Arkansas is busy reclaiming this camp, and a lot of structures have been lost in the last 20, 30 years. And so it's unclear if this is actually going to be stabilized or if we will in fact just simply lose this site in terms of a physical space. It's looking more like the latter rather than the former, unfortunately. To provide some background history for this, you see there's a Camp Monticello on the map of Arkansas. Construction began in 1942. Taking the lead on that is U.S. Congressman William F. Norrell from Southeast Arkansas, very motivated to bring this camp, partly because you see the $2 million budget for construction. That's real significant money for this region, and also the ability to bring in POWs as a labor source for agriculture and timber. Obviously, a very rural, isolated location. So if you're thinking, let's have a prisoner of war camp, that's a plus. So all these things converge around why Monticello, why this part of Arkansas. And the construction of the camp and sort of how it's built physically is very cognizant of the Geneva Conventions. So it's built on a standard plan for 3,000 man alien internment camp. It actually expanded, like the plan itself expanded as they started to build it. And the expansion of the camp was intended specifically for officers, generals and officers. And so it became clear even before Italians got there that they were intending this for sort of higher level officers and leadership rather than primarily rank and file soldiers. So there's a plan of the camp. It's really quite extensive, and it was really intense to take a tour of this with Jody and get a sense of scope. And you only wish you could repopulate it like in your mind and get a sense of the living conditions. And her work and the archaeology of the site, you painstakingly recover things like hair tonic bottles and spoons and knives that were adapted for sculpture, things like that really, help you get a sense of lived experience in the space. First POWs began arriving in 1943. Just to, here are some facts and figures. It's an amazing thing that we have 425,000 Axis POWs housed in the US, including 50,000 Italians. There are 2 camps for German POWs in Arkansas, Fort Chaffee and Camp Robertson. Then Jerome, as was mentioned, was converted into Camp Dermott. Camp Monticello is exclusively for Italian POWs. And for the Allies in general, more than 600,000 POWs were captured when Italy was defeated along with Germany and North Africa, an incredible, staggering amount, including much of the high command. So 50,000 of those POWs are headed for Arkansas after first spending some time in northern Scotland in much worse conditions than they would encounter in Arkansas. And so we have 1,850 men in 1944. You can see the list: generals, colonels, lieutenant colonels, majors, captains, first lieutenants. And this tells you a lot about the population. This is going to be a fairly well-educated slice of Italian population. It's pretty clear that most did not have English skills, but they were highly educated. It's also, in a sense, a kind of a visible group. That is, treatment of these prisoners is going to be something visible, like internationally, because of the level of the prisoners held. And so obviously the question is always, what was life like? Well, running water, electricity, and abundant food. Like, not necessarily, for Italians, not necessarily the best food they ever had, but certainly wholly different and way better and more abundant than what they got in Mussolini's army. Running water and showers were a complete revelation compared to what they had been experiencing. So in a sense, that's really good, especially if you consider the context in which rural farm laborers, Americans in Southeast Arkansas, are in significantly worse conditions without running water and without electricity and without not to say abundant, but even sufficient or necessary food. So there's a pretty grinding contrast between what's happening in the camp and what's happening outside of it. And in terms of which form of captivity is actually like more brutal. So, but it doesn't change the fact of confinement. And this observation by Metro of the International Committee for the Red Cross points to the fact of confinement is still traumatic. The fact that they just don't know what's happening, especially as the war progresses. Italy was defeated and switched sides in the midst of the war. And so you note there's a very sad atmosphere in this camp that's difficult to remedy. And the prisoners, like, how do you cope? And so the prisoners built a shrine, a kind of mini church for La Madonna del Prigioniero, the Madonna of the prisoner. And this was just a focus for camp cultural activities, prayer, singing, mass. And so this becomes a real focal point. Unfortunately, this is a picture from the 60s. This entire structure is gone now, except for the base for the Madonna, who's also gone. So we've lost a lot in terms of architecture and archaeology. Many of you probably don't know, some of you may know that there's a movie made about Camp Monticello that was released in 2018, The Forgotten History of Camp Monticello, in which an Italian daughter who's now in her 50s revisits Camp Monticello, where her dad was held, who had been an airman, a pilot, and shot down in the Mediterranean off North Africa. And so she comes to Arkansas to try to piece together the story of the camp. It's 50 minutes. It's actually a really interesting movie, and it does a good job of moving between sides, between the daughter's perspective, what they've got from the father and what they've got from his wife. And so also it includes a fair number of sections of like basically war propaganda, playing up the great qualities of the American, of the prisoner of war camps built by Americans for Italians and others, in this case for the Italians. And as propagandistic as those films are, there's still a look inside. And so they still have a lot of value. So I pulled a couple of those out. And hopefully they will play. That's always the great question. And maybe you'll hear them.
New York, being creative and using art, creativity as an outlet for those feelings.
The prisoner finds himself in a camp composed entirely of his own countrymen. He finds the men proud of their camp, sees many of them with the Italians' traditional flair for art, employing their time in beautifying the grounds around their quarters. A self-taught painter who hopes someday to exhibit his art to the world.
Yeah, so it's a pretty upbeat film about a situation that's not so upbeat. Let's see if we can, will you advance for us? There you go. Great. And so this will be just another quick clip from this. And this one's really interesting because it gives you a peek into labor conditions and juxtaposes that with food and with the account of one of the American camp guards. So I'm just going to play this a very short clip.
We'd take out maybe 50 prisoners in a truck, and there would be 2 or 3 civilian trucks pick up the prisoners to cut cordwood for the government at that time. We were guards, but we just turned them loose, and they counted when they came back in. We didn't have no problems with it, because they knew they were in a good place. They got fed good. Oh golly, they'd eat pancakes. They'd fry pork chops, baked potatoes, pasta. Oh yes, a lot of pasta. About anything that was edible.
Well, the Italians intervened almost immediately in the recipes. But that view is actually fairly rosy, and it's contradicted in some significant ways. And one of those is, so this is on the right-hand side, you see a newspaper article from a violent confrontation between American soldiers, African-American soldiers. White MPs were involved as well. And this was not in Arkansas, but I think in Washington, Seattle, Washington. So an Italian prisoner of war was killed, but like that violence up there resonates with tensions back here in Arkansas. As Henry Mitchell, the General Secretary of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, charged, wrote to Washington saying, "Hey, this POW labor is undermining the wages that we have and our working conditions for farm laborers here in Eastern Arkansas," which was true. And in fact, American farm laborers in Arkansas were actually moved from Arkansas, a significant number, to Maine, opening up the field of labor for these POWs, both German and Italian. So it can be a very tension-filled situation. And as that guard says, we never had any trouble. Well, newspaper reports and documentation are different. In June 1945, the chief of police in Monticello reports the recapture of 3 Italian POWs who escaped. Another arrest of a black man, James Swift, for treason, a 60-year-old black man for sheltering an escaped POW, Luciano Cinsoli. And so that rosy picture you're getting doesn't seem to have been totally the lived reality, which included escapes. And if they were being so well fed, so well treated, we're so happy, what explains this? And so the game, and hopefully this isn't too much of a spoiler about what happens in the game, but in any case, we wanted to build in this aspect of the Italian POW experience. And we realized there was a chance there, if we could bring Angelo together with Leslie, then we could recreate some of both a shared experience, but also maybe some of that tension. And so that's what we chose to do in the game. So that's it for the Italian experience in Monticello. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeannie now. Are you going to do it for me? Okay, good. Jeannie, are you there?
I am here.
Fantastic.
I'm enjoying everything. That was a great presentation. And Joshua, that was the best presentation on the internment camps I think I've ever seen. So that was great. I appreciate it. I won't talk to you
That's
about
high praise,
things,
Professor Wayne. I appreciate it.
I've seen a lot of them too over the years. Okay, well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I will try to be as quick as I can, because I know we're past time and I know how that feels. You might be planning on dinner or something sometime in the near future. So I was asked to talk about peonage, and I've written a lot about that and read a lot about that. So here we go. We have to start with the 13th Amendment, and actually it's a wonderful amendment, right? It abolished slavery, but there is so much it didn't do. And if you look at one particular line, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted. That is a very loaded piece of the phrase. It's what's going to lead them ultimately to the carceral state that we're dealing with today. But it also opened up the possibility of peonage. So go to the next slide. So, however, there was an 1867 peonage law passed in response to a problem that arose not in the South, which you would expect it, but in New Mexico, having to do mostly with Native Americans who were being held in peonage. And that particular decision argued that it violated the 13th Amendment and reaffirmed the notion that you couldn't enslave somebody, and it included the word debt, right? So debt peonage is against the law. However, go for the next slide. It was ignored in the South until the early 20th century. And to understand what happened in the South, you need to understand that during the Civil War, a decision was made to keep the plantation system running. And once that decision was made, and instead of the alternative, which might have been confiscation and redistribution of plantations, once that decision to keep the plantation system going was made, that necessitated an abundant labor force. And the most abundant labor force possible was that of now freed people in the post-Civil War period. Now, during the Civil War, however, the Union Army instigated a contract labor system, and that continued without the Army's presence for a few years after the war was over. And then something called sharecropping popped up. Next slide. Now, sharecropping, you don't have to read that in the middle. I don't think I have time to go over that much stuff. But in any case, what we commonly see sharecropping as arising as a kind of compromise between planters who didn't have cash to pay wages, which is what the contract labor system required, but did have land, and freed people who really wanted land but didn't have the cash to buy it, but they could work their own plots of land in return for a share of the crop. And that all might have worked out better. Worked out fine. Ransom and Such, who wrote a book, One Kind of Freedom, suggests that it might have been just a good arrangement, except that some laws are going to be passed that are going to undermine it. So African Americans initially, immediately after the Civil War, expressed their freedom in a number of ways, bringing families back together, establishing their own churches, known institutions, but also moving into these sharecropping arrangements, which again might have been good. But planters are determined to bring them keep them under control. They know they desperately need labor. African Americans are slipping away, and they continued to slip away even after all these onerous laws were passed. Next slide, please. So the planters turned to the courts, the state courts, and the legislature to pass laws that will keep African Americans controlled. They passed vagrancy laws. You can be arrested for not having money in your pocket or not having much money in your pocket. Laws that stipulated that if you left the planter to whom you owed money, you could be brought back to the plantation and forcibly by a constable or a marshal or a deputy sheriff or something, and made to work. This was, and being in debt became kind of endemic in the sharecropping system, because African American laborers often were not literate enough to speak authoritatively with planters. The contracts were often, not always, but often just handshakes or something of that sort, verbal contracts, not written contracts. And it was dangerous if you were African American to challenge a planter when he settled with you at the end of the year. And that's the way the sharecropping system worked. You didn't get your money till the end of the year. And so during the course of the year, you have to get advances from the planter just to survive. And usually that meant getting materials, food, etc., from the planter's commissary. So you were almost bound and determined to be almost certainly going to be in debt. So out of this also arises convict leasing. Some people would be arrested, maybe for having absconded with debt, and turned over to the authorities. Convict leasing was horrible. Southern legislatures wanted to get rid of it, but the virtue of convict leasing is the lessees, which are often construction companies or large planters or that sort of thing, they paid for the prisoners and took them out, and so it unburdened the state from having to take care of them. That did give way to the prison farm system in the early 20th century, which wasn't much better. And then, and again, the carceral state from the 1960s onward. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about a couple of famous peonage cases, or one not so famous, but famous peonage cases in Arkansas. There was a peonage case in Ashley County in 1904. It's not very well known. I found some information on it. A couple of brothers, the Pews down there, distinguished family, as a matter of fact, who happened to know about this event. But in any case, they were convicted, but the fine was very small. There was a more obscure case in Poinsett County in 1912, but they are acquitted. And the difference between 1904 1904 and 1912 is whose president and whose Justice Department it is. And in 1904, it was Theodore Roosevelt's Justice Department. In 1912, it's actually still, I think, Taft. It might be Wilson. It probably rolled over to Wilson, which would not have been good for African Americans, right? So, and then third, a kind of famous one would be Crittenden County's Paul Peacher case in 1936. He was convicted. He was the marshal. He was in Crittenden County again. He was the marshal, and he had a contract to clear some land. So he just arrested a bunch of African Americans on trumped up charges, most likely vagrancy, and put them to work. Of course, he didn't have to pay them, right? So he put them to work, and he is eventually convicted in federal court in Jonesboro, as a matter of fact. But landowners paid his $3,500 fine, which suggests that even in the 1930s, when the tenancy system, sharecropping system, was about to begin its slow, agonizing death, it was still important for planters to protect the existence of that form of labor. Next. So I have to talk about Sunnyside. I beg your pardon. You didn't ask me to talk about Sunnyside, but it was also another peonage case. It began innocently enough, and maybe with goodwill in mind, by Austin Corbin, who was a New Yorker, banker, financier, wealthy man, who bought some property in Chico County, and he didn't know what to do with it. So he got this scheme in mind that he would bring these Italians over and put them on plots of land and sell the land to them. That was the original scheme. He had some influential friends, the Italian ambassador. He was friends with the Italian immigration official in New York. So he was an influential person. The only problem is he brought them over, got them started, and then was killed in a carriage accident, I think, in New York. And his descendants didn't know what the heck to do with this property and didn't care about this project. And so they eventually, within a couple of years or a year, sell it to the Crittenden Company, which is made up of 3 planters from Mississippi, one of whom was the famous Leroy Percy, who becomes the sort of spokesperson for the family. And they, of course, implement no holds barred, the pernicious and exploitative sharecropping system. And of course, as Joshua said about Laura and Jerome, conditions were terrible down there. These Italians were not used to this kind of environment, the mosquitoes. They fell prey to the diseases that attend mosquitoes. So there were some escapes, and they got the word out that they were being exploited, and there were a couple of Justice Department reports. I think they were both during Roosevelt's administration. Yes, they were both during Roosevelt's administration. One was by Michelle Berardinelli. It's a lesser known report that Pete Daniel brought to my attention. And the other was a little better known, the Grace Quackenboss report, she was an interesting woman. She sort of came into actually it was over in Mississippi, where Leroy Percy was, and she visited him and made real nice with him, and they thought they were charming her, and she thought she was charming them. But in the end, she wrote a report that was very displeasing to them. And of course, Theodore Roosevelt was a good friend of Leroy Percy's, or at least had hunted with Leroy Percy. So that was not pursued, but there was plenty of evidence. If you read both these reports, there were plenty of evidence for peonage charges that were never pursued. Pass, next slide. Is that the last one? Okay, here. Okay, so how do you conclude this? First, that the 13th Amendment was never intended to address the rise of debt peonage. It had one purpose, to end slavery. But that one line in there is a ticking time bomb that, yes, it's still ticking with the carceral state, but its initial, it initially ensnared that line did the African Americans, and of course, it's ironic but interesting that the first case about it arose not in the South, but in New Mexico with regard to Native Americans, speaking to how others have been exploited in the United States. African Americans define their own freedom, sense of freedom, that is, bringing their families together, been separated by slavery, by their institutions, by moving around. And one of the reasons they turned to Italian laborers in Chico County was because so many African Americans had left. So peonage was effective in keeping African Americans in place, but it wasn't a perfect way to keep them in place. And we know this because they weren't kept in place in Chico County and many other places, but it made it difficult for them to better themselves economically. So the 13th Amendment and the 67 law are circumscribed by Southern laws and eventually by federal indifference. And finally, the contemporary counterpart to this flaw in the 13th Amendment is the carceral state. So that concludes my talk. Did I come in on time? I did it. All right.
Well,
I hope
thank
we
you.
have a little time to talk.
Yeah, I mean, we do. And I want to thank all the presenters for covering this history, which is intense and intertwined and complex. And even in our vertical slice or prototype of this game, I think we start to pull out some of those complexities, but let me not share my screen. There we go. And also, I think we could probably just open it up for questions. Ooh, that's not the one I wanted. So I'm opening it up in the chat. And I haven't had a chance to read this through, but maybe you have, Bree. So if we got any questions that have emerged in the chat as we've been going along, we might first address.
I think the only one that hasn't been addressed so far was Jeannie asking about Senator
Inouye. I think you pronounce it Inouye. I think is how I
Mhm.
grew up saying it. He was in the Senate when I was most of your ages. So yes, is anybody aware of that story? Joshua, do you know that story?
So he was at Camp Shelby. I knew that he served in the 442nd, so that
Well,
makes
maybe
sense.
not. Maybe it wasn't the 442nd, but he was at Camp Shelby. So do you remember what happened? Do you know what happened?
No, I don't know
Yeah,
the story.
He told this story, and my student Caleb Watanabe mentioned it in his excellent MA thesis, comparing internment in Hawaii, Japanese internment in Hawaii, with Japanese internment in Arkansas. It's a very good MA thesis. But in any case, he spoke to something I think you'll find interesting, that in that training camp for Japanese Americans, there was conflict between the mainland Japanese, meaning mostly the West Coast Japanese, and the Hawaiian Japanese.
Yeah.
And the difference is explained that in Hawaii, internment was very selective. They didn't just intern everybody. That would have been 40% of Hawaii's population.
Yeah,
They
that's
only
right.
interned people. They only interned adults, and usually the father, sometimes both parents, but usually the father. They usually had some kind of charge, and of course, most of the time it was speeches. It made no sense, but they turned them anyway. So that was, in a way, sort of notion of what, big deal if it's bad, but families are not. He had a different notion of what internment was like, and so there was tension about the way they spoke English. I mean, all sorts of things at the camp. But then one of the commanders over there got this bright idea to send them all to Roar for a party at Roar. So Senator Inouye gets on the bus and with his compatriots from Hawaii, thinking, oh, we're going to go have a party and meet some Japanese American girls, and they don't realize until the bus pulls up to Roar and they see the camp. They don't understand what their California Japanese American compatriots have gone through and what that experience has been for him. And he said that it made a huge difference in the sort of mean, what they want groups to do in boot camp is cohere, right? And this was a big problem. They were not able to. And after that, I'm sure there were problems, but it according to the senator, it made it better. So anyway, I thought it was a great story. You can maybe add it to your.
There we go.
Cool. So am I missing any other questions? If we don't have any in the chat that have not been answered, then now's the time to pose additional questions. Like you could send them through the chat or you can ask them directly. Just unmute yourself and have at. Am I seeing anybody? Do we have any questions?
To whom will the demo be available?
That's a great one. That's a great one, Terrell. Very practical. Actually, have we pasted the link for it in the chat
right now?
Yeah, we're just going to throw the link in there. So yeah, and it's continued to evolve. You know how games are. So Terrell knows very well how Terrell was in Game Design 1 and ended up making actually a really fun game at the end of that course. But you know, you're always tinkering and polishing and fixing bugs up to the very last second. So this is our most recent release. Should play through all the way without any like game-breaking situations happening. And the only thing is about putting this in the chat right now, which we're fine to do, is that we also have a how to play PDF that's like a page and a half. And that's kind of handy, but I think most people can just kind of figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's what I did. I always roll through something and you send it to me and I didn't even notice you sent me a PDF and just jumped straight in.
That's actually, you know, yeah, no, that's fine. That's totally fine. And for most people, it won't even be an issue. It'll be fine.
I don't think it'll be an issue. Yeah. I did have to figure out a couple of things, but I just kept moving the pointer around and it worked.
Yeah, no, and that's actually, I mean, the truth to tell, if your game is figure outable that way, if it can be figured out through that kind of testing, like, do I do this? Maybe I do that. Actually, if they can discover how, that's actually better than like leading people through the nose through what they're supposed to do in the game. So yeah, there's the link and please have at. We are very much open to responses. You know, just even a quick note that says, hey, this seems broken, or, ooh, you could have done this, or I don't understand why this content was in the game. And you'll see, I mean, it's definitely intended for education. And maybe it shows its colors a little too much about that on occasion, but I don't know. I just have to say I'm incredibly proud of the development team for pulling this game together through the year of COVID.
I will say that when I was exploring something you said when we first started tonight, Dave, about the emotional response that you can have even when it's a point and click game. And so it's not as interactive, but you're doing mental work. I had that moment last night when I was going through it again, looking at all the buttons with the peonage situation.
Yeah.
And there was a moment where I'd made a choice and then it became a violent situation. And it's like, whoa, okay. Yeah, that went quicker than I expected, but then I had to think back, like, yes, that's how this would have played out socially.
Yeah. Yeah, it's yeah, and there's other games, and we had definitely inspiration that I didn't put any of that into our talk, but there's a number of really heavy duty games about historical trauma. One of them is this War of Mine. That's probably the heaviest one. Another one is Where the Water Tastes Like Wine is another one. And actually what Derek Camp's going to talk about is a really good example. You know, Am I Not a Man? I'm a man and a brother. And so his VR game on Martin Luther King is quite intense on that score. Even though it's a VR, it's like 3D fully immersive, so quite different generic in genre than our game. But games can really address, because you have that sense, no matter which genre, that I'm making a choice here. I'm in a game, I'm in a system, I'm making a choice, like, oh, there's consequences. That changes a lot about how you're thinking about history. Because we usually think of history as what happened and we can't change it, right? So it's real different to be in it and just sense that you can change it. So yeah, so I'm really proud of the team for putting this together when we had to move from being face-to-face development to remote development, and still we are remote. And so it's really an incredible job by that team.
Dave, can I ask, in Morning in Your Eyes, you hired actors to stand for the images. Did y'all do this with that?
We did not. We went ahead and just drew them. We are extremely fortunate to have the art team that we have. Some of the people have been on this Zoom. I know I saw Theo. Rachel was here for just a little while. So we've had we're just fortunate to have those artists and be able to draw both the characters and to carry out like the backgrounds. And it has I think its art style is quite impactful for what it's trying to do. And so that a lot of that goes to Brianna, our art lead. So we didn't hire the actors for that. And we really have thought a lot about adding voice acting to it. And I think we probably won't. But I do think we probably will add some music as far as the audio track. And Liam's going to talk. I actually think the audio track right now is quite effective. And it does some really cool stuff to build tension. Like there's already some really cool stuff.
I have some anecdotal supporting evidence for that, which is that I left it going and then went away from my laptop for like an hour or two. I came back and just put my headphones on, and it was the sound surrounding Angelo.
Yeah.
And so it was this instantly immersive thing because I forgot that the game was on. But I was like, oh, where am I again? Yeah.
No, sound's a big part of it.
County.
No, it's incredible in games and video games all across the board. Audio is this hugely important thing that lots of people overlook, but now people who game. But as far as like thinking about history and games about history, if you think of that acoustic environment as something you have to historically reconstruct, would they have had, they wouldn't have had these kinds of engines. They wouldn't have had this density of traffic. Even like what birds, like what was the natural environment like? And all that stuff starts to come out that's very sensual and very connected with environment and super important to how people feel immersed. If the soundtrack's good, the audio is good, it can carry that load that you don't, like you're not counting on the 3D video, like it has to be super realistic and surround you video, like in terms of your vision. It's doing that audio wise. And I think you get a lot of possibility by weighting the audio over that 3D world. Super interesting. Okay, any questions that folks have? Well, if not, we're at a good spot. We did go a bit over, but I thought there's a lot of rich history here. And it's a history that unfortunately a lot of Arkansans and Americans don't know. And especially this move to interpret it like laterally, to think across these different forms of captivity, resistance, trauma, resilience. So we think that the project's really important from that standpoint. So we have 3 other Zooms coming up, and one's really going to dig into how making the game is its form of doing history. And then like, here are all these game engine related like projects that we have ongoing on campus, and seeing them all together, it'll be like, boom, here's this one, boom, here's this one, there's this one. Getting them all on the table is a way to start thinking about, okay, how does this inform what we want to do as a campus in terms of digital humanities? And by no means are all digital humanities game related, but that's a big sort of vector or piece of digital humanities is immersive and game related. And so where we think we're going as a campus is a really good discussion to start having around that. And then again, that's going to be 7 to 8 p.m. tomorrow. And then Derek Ham's going to present 8 to 9. And like I said, he's an amazing VR developer, not to be missed. He's really good. So thanks to everybody who presented and everybody who came. This was really a great attendance and a great way to kick this off.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
for sure.
you.
Okay, ciao.
Bye.